And part of that listing, though, I think, is saying, no, the current status quo is not acceptable, and we need to stop it.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. This week's guest is Lesley Wood, Professor of Sociology at York University in Toronto. Lesley is interested in how ideas travel, how power operates, how institutions change, and how conversations influence practices. More importantly, she's interested in how people resist, how conflict starts, transforms, and ends. A lot of her research focuses on protesting, and she is herself an activist. You can visit her own website and blog at lesleybikes.wordpress.com. Now, in this conversation, we talk about a lot of things, as usual on this podcast. We talk about the difference between being more connected, yet at the same time more fragmented. Identity, defining identity, meaning what is us versus what is them. The stories that emerge from that, and of course, identity politics. What can and should be achieved through protest? What is signaling? Why are the deep changes so hard to see here and now? And what about the spectrum between global issues and local issues? Another question that we raise is how to not be so human-centric, but rather Earth-centric, our relationships to the Earth. Finally, if we all believe that we're screwed, which seems to be a way to think in modern life, then what do we do about it? Now, if you like this show, please give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use, and go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes and ways to get in touch with me to give me your feedback on this episode or any other. Or you can go on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. The podcast is on all of those platforms. I'd love for you to reach out and get in touch. Lesley Wood, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for coming. I'm really excited to chat with you. I've looked into your work, obviously, before this. I prepare for every conversation, even if it doesn't seem like it. And there's a lot of stuff that you have talked about and written about that I'm excited to dig into, whether it's the militarization of the police, especially when it comes to protests, your book, Crisis and Control, and your blog on WordPress, which I found really, really interesting too. There's a lot of things in there that I'm keen to talk about. And one thing, and I'm not sure if this was deliberate, but the subtitle of your blog is I have no idea. Did you notice that?
I did notice that.
Okay, I thought it was, no, I only asked because I thought it was like a field that you said, I don't know, and then you just left it blank.
No.
But why, before we get to the first question, why I have no idea?
Well, because I believe that to be true. I feel like half the time, well, really most of the time, we really do not understand what's going on in the world. And we can try and figure out the little things. But, no, we don't know. I mean, if we knew, we'd be acting, I think, quite differently.
I love your answer because it's now the preface to my question. Lesley, what on earth is going on?
Oh, my God. What is going on? I know, and I've tried to prepare for the question thinking, well, where do you start?
Well, where would you like to start? Like, if you had to answer that question and you only had one place to go, what's the number one burning thing going on right now that you just want to have to tackle?
Well, I have to say it's March 15th, 2019, and it's a pretty dark day with the massacre in New Zealand and bombing in Gaza and the Ethiopian. There's a real, I think, sense of grief right now about how has it come to this. There's a climate strike happening. That's a hopeful thing, in terms of youth walking out of school in order to try and get folks to do something about climate change. But I mean, front of mind is definitely this massacre in New Zealand and thinking, my God, how do we understand the rise of kind of active hate attacks at the current moment, at a time when we're both more connected internationally, communication-wise, information-wise, and fragmented in terms of trust, in terms of identity, in terms of a sense of what's going on.
That's been a theme of this podcast, actually. When I ask people that, there's multiple ways people put it. Some people say I'm optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. Some people say we're living in an age of intense connectivity, but we're also fragmented and alone. And in light of those things, it's really difficult for us to put this thing that happened in New Zealand, this shooting of almost 50 people who died and another almost 50 people who were injured in Christchurch, which only a few years ago had a devastating earthquake. How do we put this into context? You know, some people find it easy to simply wave it off and say this is one madman who went off the rails and is an anomaly to our daily lives. But there are others who very reasonably suggest that there are deep social forces at play, and that there are people who with their speech and their actions are enabling or at least encouraging this kind of thing to occur. I'm not saying that someone makes a speech and therefore they're responsible for the death of 50 people. But what I'm saying is that the cauldron of anger and hatred and resentment, ressentiment, to use the French word, which was very important in the revolution of the 18th century in France, you know, that this cauldron is bubbling over, and we can't really be surprised when things like this occur, because there's such a clear connection to the anger around the world, and the connectivity that propagates that, I think. But I mean, or am I making too clear of a connection? Am I going out too much on a limb to say that the cauldron is responsible for this?
Well, I don't know if I'd describe it as a cauldron, because it's hard to see patterns in a cauldron, although you can see temperatures go up and down. But I do think that there are patterns at play, there are forces at play, and in the last, one of the things I've been trying to understand is at the local level of Canada and the U.S., I've been looking at changing forms of political action since Trump and in the period up to Trump. And I'll try not to go too far on a tangent here, but in the period before Trump, I was interested in how I felt like there was a form of politics that was emerging that was in some ways quite hopeful, you know, talking about Idle No More and Black Lives Matter, and thinking about how do we create another kind of world that isn't based on supplication to authorities, but, you know, creating a new world and that sort of thing. And but also had a really strong role of identity playing out in it. And then I started to see in the kind of the rise of Trump, and also looking at what was going on in Europe, the reaction of the kind of white nationalist and white supremacists and xenophobia. This is, of course, at the same time as the migration flows increasing from the Middle East and stuff. And you do see these movements really become much more visible in the era post-Trump. So in 2017, you see a lot of Islamophobic violence. You see white supremacist violence in the U.S., but also in Canada and definitely in Europe. And it's, I'm not saying it's like Trump's fault. But I think that there's of course a whole other online world that's playing out as part of this. But there's signaling going on, and the election of Trump offered a kind of an opportunity for those voices who had felt like, you know, whiteness was under threat or whatever, to communicate and gain strength. And you do see this on the streets, and you do see this, I think, in the attacks, and you see this online. And you also see a real strong response from the left, you know, and sometimes quite a liberal left, saying, no, human rights, diversity, it's still a thing, right? And some of that was people who had not been in the streets before, whether we're talking about the Women's March or, you know, Climate March, or the movements around immigration. pro-immigrant rights over the last few years. But anyway, back to thinking about New Zealand, the fact that the shooter cites the shooter in Quebec and is part clearly of a global conversation of Islamophobia is, this is not unconnected. This is not just an individual act. This is tied to activation of particular boundaries, feelings of threat and fear, and finding targets. And every time we think, not another Pittsburgh, not another Quebec City, it feels like there's another one. And so what do we do?
Well, there's a word that you just mentioned, which I'm really glad you did, and it was conversation. That the shooter in New Zealand is in conversation with others around the world, and partly it's the conversation that is playing out, that they find in this dialogue that this is what they feel they have to resort to. We're having here, obviously, a conversation. This is what it's a dialogue. But there's something in your work also that's at play too, in that you talk about mass movements and protests being conversations, that they're really, really critical to understand, not just as people coming out and trying to change the world and make their voices heard, but people trying to have a dialogue with institutions, with people on the other side of it. So that the other side of this conversation where people are resorting to violence is another conversation where people are resorting to going out into the street and trying to reclaim spaces, whether that's Occupy Wall Street or in a very real way, the Tea Party, which grew up with Occupy Wall Street. And they both created different results, as we know. But we're talking about conversation. Is this right? Am I saying this right? And is this how we see it? And if it is, what's the end game of that conversation? Or is it just establishing the dialogue in and of itself?
Again, it's like, which conversation? I do think that, I see the world very much as interactive. And this, when I'm thinking about identity, I'm saying, okay, what is our identity? So what's the boundary? Who's us? Who's them? How do we understand them? How they understand us? How does us act? How does them act? And there's stories that are come about in any sort of identity. So I think when we're talking about white supremacist or Islamophobic networks, there's a story being told about who's the them, who's the us, how do they treat us, what the threat is, and how we need to respond. And my sense is that right now there's a lot of cynicism, for some good reasons and some bad reasons, about narratives of human rights, narratives of success, of the system working. And so the trust is broken down in those narratives. And so then who do people start to trust? They trust those who are they see as most like them. And who do they start to then blame? There starts to be stories told about who's at fault, who's different, and so I think that I feel like I'm being kind of incoherent right now, but I feel like there's stories being told online and offline in larger media and with authorities, but also just amongst people about how do we explain where we're at and where we're going. Because the central shared narratives are no longer there. And so, I'm not like a big diehard fan of we need a centralized media conversation. But I feel like when we're in a situation where we're fragmented and there isn't a place to come together to talk across difference, we end up in these silos, right? And I'm sure you're coming up with this in other conversations.
Absolutely. And I think what I'm getting from you is that the answer to the question, what on earth is going on, or the explanation that these groups are trying to create for the world around us are iterative. And by that I mean they're mediated and they're developed by the people who are involved in them. So in other words, the truth is something that we discover by deciding upon it together. So that if we, and by truth, I don't mean the facts on the ground. I don't mean we're going to invent new realities and, reinvent the wheel or say 2 + 2 = 5. But that the way we want to live is something we can decide through and in that conversation that we have by taking to the street, for example, in a protest, or It can also be the way that I interact with other people online and encourage and add to that conversation there. One thing that you've obviously spent a lot of time studying are protests and mass movements. And I have a simple question about that, which is, if whether it is or isn't this iterative discussion of this explanation of and this answer to what on earth is going on, whether or not it is that, what can or should a protest achieve? Like if I'm going to go out into the street because I'm so angry with something that the government did, or I even want to go and protest this action that occurred today in New Zealand, what am I going to achieve by doing so?
What are you going to achieve, or what do you want to achieve?
I guess both, or what can I achieve? What am I able to achieve? I mean, it's all of those things, I guess. Yeah. So a triple thread question.
I think that. I can say one thing that I think is underlying a lot of my answers,
sure.
which is this understanding that I take from one of my mentors, Charles Tilley, who talks about the relationship between regime and repertoire. So by regime, the system of power, the authorities, and the repertoire, the things that people are doing from below. And so I'm always thinking about that relationship when I'm trying to answer these questions. But I think I'll answer. So I think when you go out into the streets, what you can be doing a number of things. You can be going in order to feel connected to other people. And as an organizer, which I'm also, you're trying to build people's sense of their own connection and power. And I think in some ways that's what most protest is most successful at doing. It's not necessarily about immediate impact on policy or authorities. But I do think that if you, and this is sometimes to do with timing, if you have the people at a particular moment, that can be a threat to authorities who are managing the status quo, that then can, at the most basic level, give them pause about what's going on and say, what the hell's going on? And maybe they seem to be wanting something different.
Well, and another thing that I think you've written too before is that to protest can increase the cost of the regime continuing to do things the way they've done.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. And so there is a threat to it. And it's so one of the things I teach right now, a class, an undergrad class in social movements, and there is a real desire by, I think, most folks to really believe that if we care about something and we go out into the streets and that if there's enough of us, then the government will take it seriously and then they'll change. And it's like, it's just about them knowing. They need to know that we care, and they need to know, and that and other people need to know that the issue exists and it cares. But I think that fundamentally misunderstands the relationship there. It's not. It's not primarily about knowledge, I think, and information. It is a struggle, right? And so those people coming out are powerful, partly because of the threat they pose to those who are running the system. And I'm not an instrumentalist in the sense that I feel like there's a small band of people that are planning the world, and there's a small there's system benefits certain people.
It is, I think, I can't remember who said this, but it doesn't have to be a conspiracy for people to collaborate and work together for their better ends. I mean, we don't have to believe that there's an Illuminati in order for there to be a 1% of the 1% whose wealth is accumulating as a result of the system that has been built.
Yeah.
In other words, a conspiracy doesn't require this secret cabal of evil intent.
That's right. I mean, I think right now we're in a moment where protest is being... I think there's a lot of thinking happening about protests right now because, in fact, in the last 5 years, there have been more protests and bigger protests, especially bigger protests and globally coordinated protests than ever before. And yet there's a sense of what is it doing? And I don't know if this is where your question is coming from.
Yes, in part, for sure. And it's been a question of mine that I've been wondering is like, what where is this going? What does this achieve? And let me give you a personal anecdote as to where this is anchored for me. So I lived in London for 3.5 years in the UK, and was really, I'd never seen protests like that before in my life. I was quite insulated when it came to how people can take to the streets. And in Britain, there's not only a consciousness of your ability and power of protest and how much power you wield, because people really do change not only the conversation, but legislation, and they shift paradigms all the time by having hundreds of thousands of people take to the street. And it's one thing that you've written about that, for example, when the Iraq war started and 1 million people took to the street, I think it was 1 million people in London, that itself changed the way that we looked at that event. In other words, it wasn't just showing to the people in power, it was showing to everybody that there is not just people who disagree, but people who can take power if they so choose, whether they're not showing up to work the next day or they're not going. It's going back to the Greek drama Lysistrata, where the women refused to have sex with the men until they solved the problem. But here's my question, or here's my issue. So when I saw this, I was really inspired by it because I saw, and this was Occupy Wall Street was happening at the same time, and I found it really, really powerful. And also the other element to British society too that may be distinct is that there's much more class consciousness. People know what class they're in, where they come from, and how that kind of fits together in puzzle pieces with everybody else. But I saw almost every single time with a protest, a lot of people get drunk and throw rocks and feel permission to behave like hooligans, achieving nothing. And the people who did so, I don't know if they had sympathies with the main issue of the protest or not, but it didn't matter. It enabled them and gave them permission to let off the steam and destroy. Now, am I saying that protest is bad because windows get broken? No, I'm not saying that. We know that this is going to happen. But there's two problems with that. First of all, if we're enabling this destructive behavior, are we really using the energy properly of a protest? The second thing is, though, too, is this actually just a safety valve, right? When protests occur, does all this anger and emotion that is let out in a protest, does that actually benefit the regime that's in place by allowing people to let off their steam once in a while so that they can carry on the next day with business? Because those guys that were throwing rocks in windows, pretty sure were showing up to work next day at the construction site or wherever they were going, continuing to do their jobs, right? And I just got this sense of, what is the point of this? Now, I didn't become an anti-protester. I didn't think of myself as a crusader against this. It just made me deeply question what this could possibly achieve, other than making a statement. And I guess I put that back to you. And I'm really open. I haven't obviously made up my mind on this. I don't know. I have no idea. But where do you, how do you respond to, I guess, everything I just said?
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. First, I'd say it depends. Like, the moment matters. So thinking about tactics in isolation, I think, isn't particularly useful. So one of the exercises I did in my class this week was talking about acceptable, non-acceptable, violent, nonviolent. Is it acceptable to break into animal testing labs and free animals? Is it acceptable to punch a Nazi? Is it acceptable to, so, and trying kind of breaking it down, and the conversation that emerges, and this is a tool that gets used in nonviolent direct action trainings, is that it's complicated. It depends on the context. It depends on the outcomes, the intended and unintended. It depends on the target. Does it matter if when you're blockading a shop, does it matter if it's open or all sorts of different things. So I think that when people escalate, and is it a statement that it says, so they smash stuff, is it helpful? Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, I think. And it depends on who's going to see it and think, my God, they're serious. This is different from before. It looks like things are really changing, and that destabilizes perhaps an authoritarian regime. Or is it, just like whatever, vandalism, which is totally undirected and ends up bringing the police down on vulnerable families and children.
That's right.
So it really, I think it really, we need to think about it in terms of that. I don't think that, so one of the projects that I enjoy doing is this research on the People's Global Action, which was a international network of movements that was particularly active from around 96 to about 2003. And the goal was to try and create a network of grassroots movements from around the world. And it was initiated in response to the Zapatistas in Mexico saying, we need an instrument against neoliberalism for humanity. And so, but we want to do it in a way that doesn't reproduce the patterns of NGOs that end up being dominated by folks in Geneva or New York. And we want to do it in a way that really puts the people on the ground at the center of it. And so they came up with a kind of a set of hallmarks. And one of the discussions was, are we for nonviolence? And the folks in India were saying, well, property destruction is not violent. When we burned down that McDonald's, that wasn't violent. Only hurting humans or animals is violent. And the folks in North America and Europe were like, well, I don't know. So they ended up coming up with this definition that says something like, we support using tactics that support life. As a way of getting at it, because they couldn't come to an agreement. They also, it was interesting because initially it was anti-capitalist, and then it was like, well, anti-feudalist, because in some contexts it was still feudalism, and not that necessarily moving in a particular direction, but trying to understand what's going on is always a hard thing to do.
Totally, and that's why these are hard, but also really fascinating conversations when we try to answer this question. And I think there's a lot in what you said that I want to respond to, but I gotta pick one or two. One thing is, when we talk about this global conversation and having global standards, and you just mentioned something that's really true, that people in India, for example, actually have different moral standards, not just ethical or pragmatic, but moral standards that are different from, say, someone in North America. For example, and this is something that Jonathan Haidt has looked into with his book, The Righteous Mind, which was back in 2012. He's a moral psychologist and found out through surveys that an Indian person, more often than not, will believe that having sex with a dead animal is morally wrong. Whereas a North American, Western European will say, well, I wouldn't do it. That's disgusting, but it's not morally wrong. You're not hurting anybody. Very different moral attitudes to, basic questions, whether it's incest or just the way that we run our society in general, right? And so therefore, the higher questions, higher on the order of how, what does it mean to attack private property, have very, very different responses. And I think that's so interesting because, of course, to me, going back to that previous example of protests in London, I did think it was the sort of, damage and vandalism that was not productive. That was the same yesterday as it is today. The last month's protest, they did the same thing. Big deal. A few windows are broken. It wasn't a paradigm shift. It wasn't changing the conversation. And the reason that it bothered me was because the only residue left on the street the following day was shattered glass. There was no residue of change. The world went on. Everyone went back to their jobs, and there was no sense of building or impending change that, this one was good and tomorrow is going to be bigger and bigger and bigger until the whole system collapses. And the only time that even felt slightly different was Occupy Wall Street, where it did feel like this might spiral into something bigger. And maybe that was just a small container where it felt like that. But we're not in Venezuela, right, where there could be a spiral down effect for the regime to fall. It feels like that when you see the rocks being thrown through the glass, it's just another day. It doesn't feel like it's building. But one thing that I was really interested by in your work is that it is building. It's just over a much longer arc. And I may not be aware of how my presence on the street or someone else's presence is adding to that in the aggregate.
Mm-hmm. I think it's... I have so many projects that I want to do, and I have never enough time to do it. But one of the projects that I would love to do is actually interview people through time, because I feel like that moment of being in Occupy Wall Street or the smashing of the window or whatever may not have any visible outcome. Well, less so with Occupy, I think, but it may change the people who participated in it in a way that then changes their subsequent engagement with movements, or a sense that, oh my God, I never thought that was possible. And I don't know. I'm a little bit agnostic about some of the stuff, but it's interesting when I was reading, and I think it's in the Crisis and Control book, some of the ATIP requests with the police in New York, and they were all about, we must defend the windows, we must defend the windows, because somehow the shattering of the window seemed to mean a lot to them in this way. So, and I don't know quite.
Maybe it's the old Jane Jacobs broken windows theory.
Well, that's not Jane Jacobs, right? But yes, that's the policing broken windows theory, right? Which is that once the window is gone, then the order is gone. Which I think was misused and justified all sorts of things. But yeah. I don't know, what were we talking about?
Well, no, I think you just said an interesting word, which is justification. So to what extent, I mean, I'm obviously asking questions based on, the public good and breaking windows and making sure we maintain peace and order and slow iterative progress and all this stuff. I know that everything that I've just said can be used to justify awful things done by regimes to enrich people and keep people down, to actually continue this path of inequality, of growing inequality that we see, which could break the back of our societies. I'm very aware that the arguments I'm presenting to you are used to justify such things. I just wonder, and in knowledge of that, in light of that, I wonder what can be done differently, or if things just need to be done the same, if I'm just not seeing the forest for the trees here. And I'm asking for a generally skeptical point of view, but not because I'm opposed, just because I'm trying to figure out, and maybe the principal question when it comes to protesting is, what's the point? And I think that if we were to talk to somebody over time, over 20 years, if they were a protester, how does their views change over all this time, and how are they affected by it? That's a really wonderful idea. But is that in and of itself enough to change the things that the protesters wanted to change in the first place? And there's one other idea that I wanted to throw out at you. And we seem to be throwing so many balloons in the air. How do we pull them down? But the idea that I've got is something that you've written about and other people have written about, called the Eros effect. Am I saying that right? Eros? Yeah. And it's probably something you can better explain, but generally it's this idea that, well, correct me if I'm wrong, that political movements and mass movements themselves create their own dialogue that wasn't there prior to the mass movement starting. And that the act of a protest changes the conversation it changes the paradigm in and of itself. But I know it's deeper than that, so I'll hand it to you to explain the Eros effect.
Okay. Well, the Eros effect I critique a little bit. But, what they're talking about is that moment. You saw it in Occupy, or you see it in where people look at each other and they're like, holy smokes, like there's something going on here. And so this is coming out of like Marcuse and this idea that humanity becomes a species for themselves. Like there's actually a cracking open and a release of the psychic shit that has accumulated all the years, saying you can't do it. There's no option. And that in fact, the Eros effect erupts and protest emerges internationally. And so there's stuff about 1968 and how there was like around the world people would, and we could say something about 2011-12, right, with Occupy, Indignato's Arab Spring, that wave of protests that erupted there. Now I'm a little bit more. I feel that. I definitely feel that, but I think that I'm not so much of a psychologist, so I think that there's also signaling going on. I think that's where I'm like back to the communication and the relationships that people do see, and they say, oh yeah, look, they can do it, we can do it. So I like to talk about diffusion more, the spread of ideas and how people understand things as relevant and possible. Because I do think that there are those moments, and they aren't necessarily they can't necessarily be prepared for fully when you think, oh, things are possible to change. We can do it. Which takes us back to the first part of your question, which was about, whether it's whether it's worth it.
What's the point? Yeah.
Which, and this is, I have a friend who is deeply committed to movements, and he has been traveling in the last few years to try and see, what works. And, he looks at places, he's talking to movements in the Philippines and Brazil and South Africa, where there is a deep society-wide or, sections of society-wide process of building power. And that involves, sometimes millions of people. You could look at Mexico, a case I know a little bit better, where whole communities took over the kind of landlords' houses, or in Brazil, right, took over this underused territory and said, no, we're gonna redistribute. We're gonna actually create new relationships. We're going to learn together, create institutions that work for us. And you have examples like Occupy, which are kind of micro examples of this same process that's happening on a much more successful basis in other parts of the world. But I think we're deep within the belly of the beast here. So it's very hard to imagine that any change is possible. My mother always asks me, do you ever win? And of course we win. We win policies, and we win institutions, and we win consciousness. But of course, but the deep changes are harder to see here and now, I think. So that's when you get into situations where you're like, oh my gosh, is it, what can we learn from the moments from the past and from other places that can remind us that it's possible? And I think that's partly why right now there's a real movement towards oral history, towards, even things like your podcast, to telling stories, success stories, so that we can have the hope.
One of the questions that Lesley has asked in this conversation so far is, how do we create a new world that is not based on supplication to authority? What would that world look like? How do we build that kind of world? And of course, is that the kind of world we want to build? Is it even possible? Coming up in this conversation, we ask a lot of different questions, but one thing that's connected to what I just said is, are we still living in the neoliberal moment? Or have we moved on to something else? Are we still living in a sort of late 20th century paradigm? Or has the ground already shifted underneath our feet? All of this is coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On?
This is such an interesting question about, it's not just what's the point of protesting, but what's the next step, right?
Yeah.
What happens after the protest is successful, for example?
Yeah.
And this is something that you've written about, actually. And you write that we need to, this is in the blog, we need to create that uncertainty, and once we do, we need to be ready with the next step, not simply to defend the old systems of inequality we already know, but to organize for something better, healthier, more nurturing of diverse beliefs and lives, something that recognizes how unjust power and inequality screw things up. And I think that I remember the Occupy Wall Street in London and how there was no sense of the next step. There was this great sense of coming together, that this was different, that there were people out on the street that had never come out to a protest before, and something different was animating them. And it's a theme in this conversation that we're having right now that's come up several times, of this moment where you notice that something's different here. And it was a wonderful sense, but then because there was no clear next step, it just seemed obvious that the thing would fizzle out and it would not go anywhere. And that's how I took it at the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that I was right, but it certainly meant that people like me and many others just didn't come back. Because now, is that a problem of leadership? I mean, are we going to get a Bolshevik here and say that we just need that cabal again to come in the middle and take this energy and harness it into change? Or do we just have to keep the conversation going for long enough that, again, we come to some kind of conclusion or some kind of idea, some kind of operating principle. And those seem like two very different things. Either we rush to change it, like every revolution in human history, or we wait and give it the time to come to its conclusion. And of course, we know that will never happen, because as soon as someone in power can stop it, they will. And so maybe I'm putting you between a rock and a hard place.
No, there's a whole other option.
Okay, what's the excellent? So what's the yes? Thank you.
Please, God, that would be so. Okay, we know that mobilization rises and falls, right? It's like you can look in history, and in the period of acceleration and the movement upswing, there's innovation, there's diffusion. People get new ideas, they feel connected, they come together. That intensity can't be maintained for that long, because I was in Spain, like right post into. I kind of spent anyway. I traveled around at just missing major mobilizations in 2012. So and I was in Spain in August and September. Occupy in January, February. But in Spain, there were people who'd just given up their jobs and apartments to like go and join the Indignados, hoping that I guess it would keep, or I don't know what, that it would keep going, that the world would be changed. But you can't maintain that intensity, that level of intensity. What you need to do is figure out, how do you take it to the next stage where you can sleep, but you don't lose all the people, and so that I don't think requires necessarily central. I'm anarchist, so I don't sort of look for the centralized leadership in that, but I do think you need to build leadership across the movements to figure out how you're going to keep that conversation going, keep that building going. And I think you have in Occupy things like Occupy Debt and some of the housing movements that came out of it, and then some of the stuff that was happening with, you can in Black Lives Matter and Idle No More and the Quebec student movement, that the lessons that were learned at Occupy were filtered through into those next stages, and there was learning.
Well, and can I just suggest that one of the biggest changes for me that Occupy Wall Street achieved was to change our language and to put something like the 1% into our language. There's nobody that I can think of talking to when I say the 1%, and they don't know what I mean. That has become prevalent in our language, and anything that's prevalent in our language is prevalent in our thinking. Yep. And I wonder, asking someone who is a protester and who sees the value in this, if that in and of itself was an achievement, or if that's just the beginning, if that's the tip of the iceberg.
I think it was absolutely an achievement, and it was the tip of the iceberg. Right. So a couple of weeks ago, there was Power Shift Conference in Ottawa, which was of climate justice organizers at under 35. Hundreds of people coming together, thinking about, how do we go forward? Now, I'm too old to go. But from what I hear on the ground, it was a fantastic event. And it was doing trainings, and it was thinking, how are you going to take it home? How do you avoid falling into, putting all your hopes in an electoral basket? You're not saying you need to ignore that completely, because of course it matters. But how are you going to build alternatives, whether they're food, whether they're energy, whether they're water protection? How are you going to keep the networks and keep the conversation going? I was in class this week, and I keep talking about class this week because I just did it. We were looking at the Islamophobia protests in New Brunswick around fracking, and how this happened right on the heels of Idle No More's big wave in 2012, 2013. And the community worked with the Indigenous Islamophobia community worked with folks in the Acadian community, worked with folks, environmentalists, some of whom had been involved in Occupy movements, and they got a fracking ban in New Brunswick. Or a moratorium that has been renewed since that time. There's basically the same thing in Nova Scotia, and so you're like, okay, the lessons are not lost. Now, in any kind of wave of protest, when there's a decline of the protest, what you get is battles around identity, battles around tactics, battles around goals, and they're heartbreaking. And I think it's really important. I say to some of my younger friends who are involved in movements, it's not just us that, like, those jerks, you know, they totally misunderstand what we're trying to do here. There's a split that often happens between those who want to institutionalize and those who want to radicalize as the momentum starts to decline. And we've seen this over and over and over again, and it's not necessarily the fault of the other people in the movement, right? It's just very difficult to maintain that sort of energy. It needs to change form at that point. But what you want to do is change form in a way that will allow you to come back.
And to learn from what's come before.
And to learn to what's come before.
Yeah, and this leads to kind of another question, which is you've done a lot of traveling, and therefore you've done a lot of learning. I'm sure you've met protesters and organizers and activists around the world. And therefore there is a global network. And I correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the WTO protests in Seattle at the end of the 20th century, I think 1999 was it, that this was the kickoff of this global movement that continues to today. In peaks and valleys, and Occupy Wall Street can be seen as a part of that flow, where it seemed to reach a sort of critical mass. And I wonder, to what extent are protests and mass movements local phenomena versus global phenomena? And the reason I ask that is because obviously these people can learn and trade ideas with one another. In the same way, for example, when we were talking about the Bolshevik idea of taking over something, well, there were people in the Communist International movement at the end of the 19th century who got together every year to share ideas about tactics. And there were fragmentations that occurred, just as you were saying, on the same ideas, that they disagreed on tactics or disagreed on the goals. And we have one big overarching goal, but the two of us have different ideas than what we achieved before then, and so we're going to go our separate ways. And so the left is constantly fragmented, and it's heartbreaking, as you say, day in and day out for a whole swath of society who just can't come together. But on the other hand, so many issues are local. So many issues are happening right here, right now, and it's not about it is about what's happening on the other side of the planet, because a lot of them have to do with climate change. But fracking in New Brunswick is not something that's probably going to animate someone on Vancouver Island in the same way. And so this spectrum between local and international or global, how do you respond to it? How would you advise someone who was wanting to change things on that spectrum?
What was interesting, I would actually take the Seattle thing, go back a few more years too, when we were talking about the Zapatistas and this sort of a moment. And this was a moment where you have a number of things happening, neoliberalism, and so global trade agreements are really dominating kind of economic planning. There's idea that the market can solve the world's problems, and that governments have been interfering for too long, and they've got increasing inequality as those things are starting to emerge. At the same time, of course, you have the old internet, so people are connected in new ways. And one of the things that the Zapatistas said at the time was, the way you are in solidarity with us is you working on your own struggles where you're at. And so there was this frame that was articulated or said that was like, we are against neoliberalism and for humanity. And this is the PGA network I was talking about earlier. But that you need to work locally and be connected globally. Now, one of the things that I think that's, and then a lot of, the global justice movement kind of worked on that basis to a certain extent, but it also came focused on these international financial institutions, came together around those to say no at the same time as working on whatever their local thing was. But those international financial institutions are less visible right now. There's not even a sense post-2008 whether or not we're really still in a neoliberal moment, or whether there's something else going on, or maybe it's some neoliberalism plus. We still have, of course, the G20 and G8, G7 now. But I think there's an uncertainty about how to connect that is part of the problem by which we began the conversation. And so if it's not that we're fighting neoliberalism, then what's the no? Not that the no's enough, but what's the connection? I know that there was a fellow's name, and I'm going to forget his name right now, but he was talking about pacification as a way to think about that, whether it's militarization or immigration control or environmental collapse, that this is maybe a way of thinking about it. I don't know that there's a single sort of bubble that can be explaining what exactly is going on that can link everybody. Last year, I did this project where I was looking at lethal violence in different parts of the world against protesters and trying to understand how people were building connections around that repression. And I found, maybe not surprising, that what people used primarily was, there were three ways that people connected. So out of like 36 episodes where there was lethal violence against protesters, there were only 5 where there was international solidarity responses. And they tended to be organized either around human rights frame, which still is like the kind of main way for talking about justice. Is the dominant frame, and this got lots of weaknesses and some strengths, but people know it, which is a strength. Ethnic relationships, so people who or religious, right? So Muslims, or there was the community in Darjeeling that was attacked, and there was an international mobilization around that, or Pan-Africanism, which we were talking about before the recorder came on, which was interesting to me because Pan-Africanism has also an internationalist way of thinking about imperialism and how African peoples should connect and resist. So I think that we're in an uncertain moment about how to connect the global and local.
I got a train of thought here. I'm thinking about a previous podcast episode I did with a woman named Kyla Tianhara, who's a professor of green Keynesianism at Queen's University. And she is definitely, she's been involved in protest movements. She's been an activist before. And in our conversation, we talked about if it's possible to solve ideas in the current frame, or if the whole frame needs to be changed. And a lot of her work is based on that. I mean, she's dealing with Keynesianism, which is clearly within our frame. John Maynard Keynes, the great philosopher or an economist of the early 20th century. And the question I would ask to you then is kind of a flip on that, which is it possible to deal with problems like climate change, growing inequality, which are linked, of course, and some people would say that they're linked and part of neoliberalism. Is it possible to even start to deal with these problems without protesting and challenging the system in which we live? Or is it possible that the system in which we live can incrementally deal with those problems and incorporate these ideas into them? Or is it, like, I know it's an A or B question, but is it possible?
You keep giving me A and B, and I always want C.
But I want the C. That's my point.
Okay.
I'm looking for the C.
Yeah. So the C is incrementalism is only going to happen if there's pressure on the system to make it happen. So, I think that the system could be transformed, but it's only going to do that if there's enough pressure, so that that people in power are going to.
Are you talking about, like, in, say, the 1960s, where the pressure from the left forced, capitalist countries to adopt certain socialist ideas, such as free healthcare in many Western countries? Or are you talking about something deeper?
I'm thinking about something deeper. I mean, I'm trying to understand I'm trying to learn really about what would it mean to not be so damn human-centric and thinking about our relationships to the earth. And learn from some indigenous thinkers. I would think reading Leanne Simpson recently and thinking about what are the idea of what are all our relations. How do we actually do that? And I mean, as somebody who's been raised within a Western framework, I'm very used to thinking about humans as the actors and the rest as the background, and that is clearly not working. Right? We need something that we need to listen better, and we need to And part of that listening, though, I think, is saying, no, the current status quo is not acceptable, and we need to stop it, and we need to, ensure that we don't just keep running down this road that we're going down. And so that involves, whether it's protest in terms of rallies or marches, or some sort of disruption, or some sort of creation of alternatives that replaces. I think that people can hold within them. They're on the same time a great deal of cynicism and a great deal of hope. People, almost everybody you talk to knows that this is not working, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
And so, yeah, I think it's going to involve saying no, and not expecting those in power to just do it because they've got a great new technology that's going to solve the world's problems. Like, we have to say no. The model of trying to look for how to keep capitalism going while solve climate change is so limited. I'm not saying it absolutely won't happen, but I think it's pretty unlikely.
Yeah, no, and I get you, and I think that it almost doesn't matter how much we talk about it. We're almost distracting ourselves with the conversation because the change is not occurring, right? And I think that, so here's where what you made me think of just a second ago, that when we think about the world in which we live and the systems in which we're living and the way the world works and how impossible it is to change that without changing the conversation, without changing the paradigms, right? Mm-hmm. And it makes me think that when anybody is going to the grocery store, living their daily lives, going about their jobs, there's some sense now in 2019 that we all know that something isn't working, that we're headed for the cliff edge. Climate change, growing inequality, and at one point nuclear weapons was a bigger part of the discussion, but it still should be, especially with the return of what seems like the Cold War between the United States and Russia and, of course, China. And it seems like we are running really, really quickly towards an end that we don't understand. And there are very few people out there who believe truly that it will just be fine. Like in the conversations I've had with people from all kinds of different walks of life, whether they read the news or they don't, whether they're in a position of power and responsibility or they're not, very few people, if not almost no one, will say, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. I have confidence that we're just going to sort this out, that we always sort things out in the past. It seems to me that the refrain is always, yeah, I think we're screwed, and I don't know what we're going to do. I hope that we'll figure it out. I hope that we're going to find some invention that will solve climate change, for example. I hope that the leaders will get their act together, but it doesn't look like it. And so there's this almost apocalyptic undertone to conversation. And it animates everything from going to the grocery store, going to your job. And I know this sounds flippant and I have no evidence of it. I'm just suggesting that at the end of the 18th century, a lot of paintings were suddenly in France. Right around the French Revolution, there were a lot of paintings that depicted the end of the world. It came out of nowhere. This eschatological movement in painting came out of nowhere. No one painted the book of Revelations up until that point. Revelations was boring, and all of a sudden it was the hot topic. It seems to me that our culture reflects this as well. Our culture, the movies we make, the books that we write, so many of them apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic, of another world or our world after the Third and Fourth and Fifth World War. That's where they're going, and it's kind of a reflection back to us saying, hey, we all agree, don't we, that this isn't working. And I just want to ask you and put it back on you. First of all, am I right in saying this? Do you sense the same thing? And then what do we do about it if that's true? If we really all believe that we're screwed, or we're going to be screwed if we continue this way, what do we do? Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'm saying that I'm not. This is regardless of partisan perspective. Conservative, liberal, NDP, Green, anarchist, whatever, believe that I don't know how this is going to turn out well for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that we're in a period of, all the movies are about vampires. It's like. And, I am a hopeless optimist. And that is also an opportunity in a way to be like, okay, if we're all in agreement here that this is really not working, then we have to do something else. Are we in agreement there? You know? Okay.
So then are we disagreeing on tactics and goals like protesters often do?
Well, I think it's getting people to that next it's partly about tactics and goals, but partly it's about strategy around and I think building trust across difference. And I was reading this book called Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown, who uses a lot of Octavia Butler sort of sci-fi stuff, Afrofuturist sci-fi, and she's talking about looking at, some of it's a bit outside of my comfort zone of like, we're like mushrooms, they're like starlings, they're like looking at biomimicry, looking at different models about how we need to organize ourselves. And I think that we do need to open our minds for possibility about how we can work together to build connections and trust, and how to take care of one another. Both because we're going to need to do that as things fall apart, but also because hopefully we can stop things from falling apart. So it's not the retreat to the woods with your gun, because the end times are here. It's like, let's talk to our neighbors and talk to the people who aren't our neighbors and say, okay, how are we going to make sure that the folks on the corner who don't have a place to live are taken care of? Because Rebecca Solnit, I don't know if she's got her book Hope in the Dark, right? And it talks about how crisis brings out the best and the worst. And so we want to figure out how to make sure that it brings out the best and not the worst, that we're not just protecting our people, whatever that means, defending our privilege and going into those gated communities that you were speaking about, but are making sure that those who don't have air conditioning and the temperature goes up, we need to make sure that we're taking care of them. And I think that one of the things that I'm trying to figure out, and this is maybe more abstract, is like, what temporality are we talking about here? On the one hand, there's this urgency that we need to do it out all yesterday. And then on the other hand, we need to be thinking forward 7 generations. So you don't want to go so fast that you keep making the same mistakes. Because there is that, it's like, oh my God, it's an emergency. We need to take control, lock the door, get more cops, put the budget towards, but, that may or may not be the right way to go about it. But we also need to be like, okay, how are we going to go a little slower so that we take care?
This is a funny reference, but it's like a non-emergency emergency, not unlike Donald Trump's declaration of emergency. Do you know what I mean? I don't mean to compare the two too closely together, but I mean, his declaration of emergency is clearly not an emergency in any sense of the word. But for him, it's a political emergency, right? And so what we're talking about here is it's not an emergency in the sense that, well, it is. It is and it isn't. It's an emergency in the sense that this is a crisis in terms of climate change and that we may be headed for the edge of the cliff. Well, I mean, most people will say that we are, and it's hard to dispute that. But the only way to solve it is to think clearly as if we're not in an emergency. Yes. Because people think differently in crisis, right? Yeah. And Churchill and many other people have said, never let a good crisis go to waste, which is a rephrasing of what you just said. But just to go back to the beginning of our conversation as we end it now, we talked about how ideas travel. And that's something that you spend a lot of your time on, in asking how ideas travel. And it sounds to me like, first of all, ideas travel like this, like we're doing right now. There's certainly been a lot of ideas traveling from you to me that I'm going to have to think about and wrestle with for some time. But I would also say that the only way we can deal with these emergencies and deal with these issues is for ideas to travel, for them to form and for them to travel. So I think your work really is at the center of this conversation, and in an active way, not just a passive way. So my last question to you, just before we end, if there were one thing that you could talk about in this conversation or in a part 2 of this conversation that we haven't grappled onto yet, what would that one thing be?
The one thing that I feel like I worry that I'd be misinterpreted for, which is I worry that I'm sounding a little too hippy-dippy and not recognizing that there are certain people who are benefiting from this moment. And that it is important, Utah Phillips, the kind of blues, he's a folk singer. He said, they have names and addresses. And I don't want to be like a conspiracy theorist there, but I think that we need systemic change, and that means building from the bottom up. But it also means noticing where the people who are
cui bono. Or is it cui bono or cui bene? Who benefits? Who gains?
Who benefits? Yeah, I think that's important.
That classic question, because always someone gains,
that's
and
right.
That's how you expose sometimes the under part of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
Last thing before we leave it off, I have to list the names that are on your shirt.
Oh,
because
yeah.
they've been not distracting me this whole conversation. They've actually been inspiring me and making me think, oh, right, Foucault and Marx and Mills. So here's your shirt. It says Marx, Mills, Smith, Hooks, Weber, Dubois, Butler, Jacobs, Gramsci, Foucault, Goffman, Durkheim, Bourdieu, and Hill Collins. And it's the York U SUSA undergraduate, March 2019. That shirt, I wanted it in posterity because it's been making me think the whole time, like, oh, God, what would Durkheim be saying about this conversation? So anyways, Lesley, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a really wonderful conversation.
It's been such a treat for me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
To learn more about Lesley Wood, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me and give me your feedback on this episode or suggestions for future guests and future topics to be discussed. Your quote of the week is from Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein, and special thanks for this episode to York University's Department of Sociology for giving us the space in which to record. Next week we're talking about filmmaking with Toronto writer and director Chris McBride. I'll see you then.